Mitt Romney talks tough on foreign policy, but how does his vision differ from President Obama's? You're watching Inside Story, US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. After the US media declared him the winner of the first presidential debate, Mitt Romney used a speech in Virginia to elaborate his foreign policy vision on Monday. The Republican nominee was keen to attack President Obama for what he called a lack of leadership in the Middle East. He promised to increase military spending and highlighted what he said was the shadow that Vladimir Putin's Russia is casting over Europe. Romney used assertive language on Syria, saying he'd help organize and arm the opposition to defeat the government's forces. But much of the ground covered was familiar to observers of President Obama's foreign policy. Romney's proposal for a mix of threats and sanctions against Iran didn't sound dissimilar to the approach of the Obama administration. On Afghanistan, he said he'd oversee a transition to Afghan security forces by the end of 2014, which is President Obama's policy. Perhaps most awkwardly, he affirmed the US's role as an arbiter between Israel and the Palestinians, committed to the goal of a Palestinian state. But this was in marked contrast to his comments caught on a secret video when he said the Palestinians were simply not interested in peace. Nonetheless, Romney insisted that his vision of an assertive and muscular foreign policy did differ sharply from that of President Obama.
In all these places, just as in the Middle East, the question is asked, where does America stand?
So does Mitt Romney have a distinct foreign policy vision? To discuss this, we're joined in the studio by Shibley Telhami, Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland. He's advised the US delegation to the UN on Middle East policy, amongst other things. From Charlottesville, Virginia, David Swanson. He's a progressive writer who was press secretary to the Democrat Dennis Kucinich when he ran for the presidency in 2004. And in the studio, Bruce Fein, who was a senior foreign policy advisor to the Ron Paul presidential campaign. David Swanson, then, what are we to make of that speech? Was it more about a difference in tone, if not substance? Perhaps it was about not being ashamed of American exceptionalism.
Yes, much greater difference in rhetoric than in substance. There is something of a difference if you squint hard enough. I mean, Romney wants to increase military spending. He's quite dishonest about claims that Obama has drastically cut military spending, but Obama at least is not seeking to increase it in the same way. He's more interested in paying off the deficit. But if you contrast the pair of them with someone like Jill Stein, who's the Green Party nominee and wants to cut military spending by $500 billion a year and end the wars and invest in green energy and prosecute U.S. war criminals, then you really have to squint hard to catch the difference between Obama and Romney. Romney praised the Virginian economy, in which a third of Virginians are living off military spending. That's his idea of a good economy. It's not, of course, free market that he claims to love, but it's also the worst form of government spending economically, never mind all the other disastrous side effects, and it's about where Obama is as well.
Professor, I mean, the reason why he's increasing this military spending is because he says he wants to shape history. He seems to be suggesting President Obama isn't shaping history. What exactly does that mean? What will that mean in real terms?
Well, it's hard to know what it means, and that's the problem. I mean, what he's trying to do is two things. On the one hand, he's obviously trying to move to the center of politics, because he's failed by playing the right in the primaries and then early in this campaign. At the same time, he needs to differentiate himself from President Obama and walk with swagger around the world, whatever that means. And it's not working, because ultimately when you look at the issues when you focus specific issues, whether it's policy toward Iran or policy toward Afghanistan or policy toward the Arab uprisings or even now policy toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where there seemed to be a differentiated position that he took. Now it's really the two-state solution and America's role, active role in mediating it, except by adding that there should be no daylight between him and
We'll look at some
Israel.
of those specific issues in a moment. But Bruce, I mean, are we right to be looking for some kind of substantive philosophy, or was this simply some sort of campaign a phenomenon of the campaign, basically, which we shouldn't really look too deeply into. I mean, he says that, for example, that Al-Qaeda is still a force in the Middle East, North Africa, that drones aren't a substitute for a national security strategy. But then he suggests that his national security strategy will be based on defense spending, and trade actually came up quite a bit. So, I mean, is there some echo of the project of a new American century which influenced George W. Bush so much that it's all about removing tyrants and being greeted as liberators and then everyone living in some sort of free market idyll or something? Is there something we should be looking for in this in the first place?
Well, I think there is. I think that Mitt Romney has taken the Bush-Cheney neocon view of the world to its high water mark. And I think rather than looking at the details of what he said he would do as president, which largely is an echo of what Obama's doing, if you extrapolate his view of the world, which is there's this Manichaean battle between the United States, which was the good guy, brings democracy, judicial independence, rule of law everywhere, and that there are all sorts of secret contingents of battalions of citizens around the world who are craving that we will come to their country and make it a perfect place, and that he views totally mystified as to why anyone would attack us other than they're just born in Mephistopheles' lap or something. And therefore, what he shows is a total ignorance of why it is that we're engaged in conflicts around the world, namely thousands of military bases, economic, military, other aid used to try to manipulate the internal affairs of other governments that then turn around and blow back against us. He even is unable to recognize that his formula in Syria, which is to arm people we don't know about with weapons to overthrow Assad, was the one we used with the Mujahideen to throw out the Soviets in Afghanistan. They gave us the Haqqani faction, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Osama bin Laden, and all the others. And so we have this huge, enormous symptom of arrogance that will lead the United States to ruination.
Well, let's look at some specifics, and let's look at what he did say about Syria, first of all, then.
In Syria, I'll work with our partners to identify and organize those members of the opposition who share our values, and then ensure that they obtain the arms they need to defeat Assad's tanks and helicopters and fighter jets.
But isn't that, Professor Telhami, what the Obama administration is already doing? The CIA is already trying to figure out which actors, if any, to arm. Even that statement, that it's unclear as to whether the U.S. would be actively arming the opposition.
Well, there are two parts to this that are kind of interesting to me. One is, of course, looking to people who share our values. And Al Jazeera, actually, in Arabic at least, online, had an article about the makeup of most of the rebels in Aleppo, who really want freedom, obviously, from a dictatorship. And that, with that, the American people share them. But most of them happen to be Salafis, the most active ones. Now, is he comfortable with that? Would that be people who share our values? Now, I would bet that that is not in his definition. So he runs into the same problem almost immediately when you look at the facts. The second problem is the American public. I just released a poll yesterday that we've done here in the U.S. From September 27 to October 2nd, recent poll. And only 22% of the American public support arming the rebels. Now, the American public certainly wants something done in Syria. They're frustrated. They're against the Assad regime. They support sanctions. They even support possibly a no-fly zone. But only 22%, and probably fewer among the independents. So he runs into a problem with public opinion. He runs into a problem with when you define this issue in relation to people who share our values, because that is part of the problem that he has even in Egypt.
If I could add, Shahid, this is totally utopian. Just after Obama at the United Nations said, we preserve free speech and you can criticize the president, whatever, shortly thereafter, Mr. President Morsi of Egypt and others in the Middle East says, we don't believe that's free speech. We think that there ought to be laws that make it criminal to cast religion in disrepute. And if we all, in our ability to identify, those who will support our values, he left out that it's Iraq that's helping Iran support Syria.
Also the
and those
are
these are the government that we instituted is helping Syria.
Right, and also he mentions David Swanson, the partners in the Gulf with whom the U.S. will deepen cooperation in the Middle East, but of course many of them have at least ties to various groups that perhaps many of Mitt Romney's other advisors may not be so keen on.
Well, of course, when Romney lumps together Iraq and Afghanistan and Tunisia and Libya and all of these nations, as Bruce said, as taking one part in a great battle of good against evil, he doesn't mention Bahrain, he doesn't mention Saudi Arabia, and in so doing, he's exactly like Obama. It's the same hypocrisy. I mean, the rhetoric is frightening. This talk of the attack on Benghazi as a new 9/11 that will justify as much warfare as 9/11 has been used to justify is incredibly frightening. But when you try to find specifics of what would be different between Romney and Obama on Syria or anywhere else, it's very difficult. I mean, once he's admitted that he hasn't identified which side he wants to give more support to even than Obama is already giving, you see how little we know about what he would do. And we also don't know how much he would care what public opinion was if he had just won an election. So there is a danger here, but it's not a contrast between Romney, the war maker, and Obama, the Nobel Peace Laureate.
But throughout the speech,
they are very, very close here.
Throughout the speech, wasn't there a sense, perhaps, Professor, of how the world, or how some neocon idealist would want the world to be as opposed to how it is? Even when on Iraq, he said, Obama, Obama, as a result of Obama's policies, our combat troops have left. Of course, basically, Obama did fight to have the combat troops stay, at least a much larger contingent, but were basically kicked out. I mean, what's he suggesting that he would have done differently? Again, if there had been more spending on defense, might the Iraqis have been cowed into submission and allowed a more forthright U.S. presence? I mean, what's he saying?
Well, my own view is this is a candidate who's coming off of a successful debate with the president. Now, look at why 65% of the public or those who polled say that he actually won the debate. It's not about the content. Very few people are debating whether Romney's ideas were better than the president. We're talking about who was prepared, who was sharpest, whose style was more aggressive, who was on the defensive, who was the aggressive. Style matters in politics, and look at how the narrative shifted since the debate. He knows that the president entered this, campaign with a sense that he was good on national security policy, in large part because his pullout from Iraq is popular, the killing of Osama bin Laden. Yes, the uprising in the Arab world is complicating. People really seem to understand the complexity of it. So he wants to attack him on that. He's been criticized for not being specific. He said a lot of specific things, even if some of them were, one could be skeptical about whether they were right or not in the campaign, but they worked for him. And so right now, I think they're taking this position of, at least rhetorically and stylistically, taking the upper hand, mentioning these issues. But there is a chance it could backfire against him, because this swagger reminds you of the Bush years. Remember, George W. Bush was nowhere to be found in the Republican convention. He's nowhere to be found in the whole campaign, in part because the American public don't want a repeat of what happened in those 8 years, at least in foreign policy. And so now this rhetoric is, while it has some more conciliatory language that moves him to the center on some issues, by and large that swagger is very much reminiscent of the Bush years, and there is a chance that this could backfire. In part, I think that if you look at how he structured the whole thing, you're talking about the amount on defense spending, he was also reminding people of the Cold War. I mean, he starts with George Marshall.
Right.
In part because of, obviously, the location.
What's he suggesting there, then? That we flood the Middle East, North Africa with lots of money and help rebuild these countries? The Marshall Plan, of course, after the Second World War.
In part that, but remember that he basically stand up to Putin. Right. He raises fears about China. So you have this kind of allusion to a world that America has to assert itself powerfully on the world stage, confront Russia, confront China, and work with allies to build something. And so he's reminding people of a period that I don't think the public is very comfortable with right now.
Well, here's what he had to say about Iran. Let's quickly play that.
I'll put the leaders of Iran on notice that the United States and our friends and allies will prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons capability. I will not hesitate to impose new sanctions on Iran, and will tighten the sanctions we currently have.
All right, so not much difference there with President Obama's position, Bruce Fein. He did then add, though, a sort of freedom agenda addendum, though, about how President Obama didn't support the opposition to Ahmadinejad after the election and so forth. But what's he suggesting What's he suggesting that he would have done differently, I suppose, is the question. And how does he square that, I guess, with then also his usual rhetoric about actually bombing these same people whose freedom and democracy he seems to care so much about?
Yeah, well, I think it shows an incoherence, if you will, in his thinking here. He doesn't remember that it was the United States who overthrew Mossadegh, the democratically elected prime minister of Iran in 1953 that then led to the Shah. And he doesn't recognize that, no, we have not been good. Are certainly consistent in supporting the so-called liberal forces there. So what was he going to do? Do a reprise of the Mossadegh overthrow by trying to overthrow this government? And what it also suggests, I think, Shahid, is that he still believes it's the business of the United States to direct the internal affairs of other country. That we have an obligation as the leader of the free world that everybody is summoning us to assume, to control the internal politics and the leaders of countries that we have no moral or legal responsibility for, which suggests that this is going to be a total, what I call an empire administration with Mr. Romney. And also this speech indicates that he has now surrendered his national security policy to the neocons. I say the high water mark. There isn't even a syllable in that speech that reflects any kind of moderation or restraint. This is their agenda, which they articulated as no country in the world should be able to do anything that we don't want them to do.
But I suppose we have to go back to this question as to how seriously we should take this speech. And actually that there is this particular example of his comments in public and private about Israel and Palestine. Here's what he said in public in Monday's speech.
Finally, I'll recommit America to the goal of a democratic, prosperous Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with the Jewish state of Israel.
And then, of course, this is what he said to his wealthy donors in Florida in private.
And I look at the Palestinians not wanting to see peace anyway for political purposes, committed to the destruction and elimination of Israel and these thorny issues, and I say there's just no way. And so what you do is you say you move things along in the best way you can, you hope for some degree of stability, but you recognize this is going to remain an unsolved problem.
I mean, David Swanson, it does suggest we should take these speeches with a pinch of salt. There was an article in the New York Times by David Sanger, which had some advisors saying, look, he's not terribly engaged with foreign policy, to be honest. And of course, he has his own kind of factions within his party, who he's still trying to convince that he's one of them, and so forth. So, I mean, how seriously should we take Monday's speech?
Well, I think that pair of clips shows very well the pretense that Obama and Romney and most in Washington share on this two-state solution proposal, which many in Israel and Palestine will tell you is not a real proposal. They're not serious about pushing it forward, and it's very unlikely to work. There's not enough left for a second state. There's going to have to be not a one state, but some other sort of solution, and these are people not interested in pursuing it. But on the question of Iran as well, I wanted to point out that there is very little daylight between Romney and Obama, who is constantly tightening sanctions. We've had cyber attacks. We've had military exercises off the coast, drones in the skies, threats of war, scientists assassinated. And these are not steps to build good relationships with Israel or to further peace in the world. These are steps towards war. Just as George Marshall, Romney's hero, 3 weeks before Pearl Harbor, gathered the press together and said, don't report it yet, but we're planning an offensive war against Japan. The people at VMI are aware of that history and that Marshall Plan. There is dishonesty throughout this approach that Romney takes, but it's a very close parallel to Obama's.
The Virginia Military Institute, the VMI, where Romney made his speech. But that's what's so fascinating about that, Professor Telhami, is then how quietly neocon President Obama must be. I mean, if Donald Rumsfeld and others seem to be ecstatic afterwards, tweeting away, saying what a marvelous speech. Bill Kristol of the Weekly Standard said that Romney had showed himself to be a kindler, gentler neocon. But if there's so little daylight between he and President Obama, doesn't this raise fundamental questions about what President Obama's up to?
There's no question. I think the Obama administration has to worry itself about its own foreign policy and how it comes across to the American electorate. But I agree with you on the other hand that we take the substance of speech too seriously. We should, because the American public have to take what the candidates say, very literally. But in fact, I do think it's a tactical speech. I mean, if you look at, where he has been, the people who are around him, how this is framed right after the debate, his other planned speeches to be more detailed, I think you have to look at it as tactically. And tactics sometimes work, because we saw that in the debate, we saw it in other places. So it could add up to something, at a minimum, put the other side on the defensive.
Well, let's look at some
and it forces the president to define his policy a little bit more, and therefore sometimes, even when we say, well, it's not different from Obama, it raises questions about Obama's foreign policy. So it does that as well.
Well, let's look at some of the advisors around Mitt Romney. Bruce alluded to some of the more neocon ones. 3 of actually Romney's advisors helped co-found what's called the Foreign Policy Initiative, and that's a successor to the now defunct Project for a New American Century that was so influential on President George W. Bush and led to the Iraq War and so forth. Eric Edelman, Dan Senor, Robert Kagan, all working on Romney's foreign policy team. They founded the FBI along with Bill Kristol, the Weekly Standard editor who I just mentioned, in fact. The FBI advocates strong U.S. presences in Iraq, Afghanistan, regime change in Iran, military intervention in Syria, a more confrontational posture with Russia. Then there's always John Bolton, who has long advocated a nuclear attack on Iran. He served as ambassador to the United Nations under George W. Bush. Walid Fairs is a Lebanese Christian with alleged links to several militias that operated during that country's civil war, according to investigations by Mother Jones and Right Wing Watch. He's involved in the anti-Sharia movement here in the US, which claims Islamic law is a threat to American freedom here on the mainland. On the other end, however, of the spectrum, Robert Zoellick, he's a former trade representative to the WTO. He was head of the World Bank until June of 2012. He's seen as a foreign policy realist in the mold of George H.W. Bush. And in fact, Bruce Fein, when he was named as head of the National Security Transition Team, a lot of those neocons were up in arms. And again, it suggests, isn't Romney sort of playing, a bit of a game here by trying to appeal to all sections of the Republican Party, as he is having trouble convincing them all that he is, a bona fide candidate?
Well, I think if we go above just the politics, I think what this suggests is that Romney is not a serious student and engaged in national security foreign policy, and that he will just yield and surrender to the bureaucracy, which will ask for more money, which asks for more perpetual wars. The military always wants more time to win in Afghanistan, etc. And that means that we probably will have another 4 years of the Obama trajectory to ever greater American assertion of military power and projection abroad, staggering deficits in a Pentagon whose books can't even be audited. We have a businessman promoting a Pentagon additional spending.
But that seems to be the one thing he does believe in, though. I mean, of everything, Professor Telhami, there was this sense that no matter what the details or the complexities are, 4% of GDP should go to defense spending.
Right.
Now, how does that square first with his ideas on the deficit? Or is there some sense that through that military posture of strength, that will ensure American prosperity through trade and so forth?
He might make that argument, but in the short term, no one can really reconcile that budget. No, on the one hand, particularly if you have the tax cuts at the same time, how you reconcile that? And also, it doesn't tell you why there are cuts already in the military. And partly it's his partners in the Republicans in Congress who insisted in negotiations with the president on those cuts. So it's kind of, there's definitely a lot of camouflaging of the issue of cuts. But I have to say, I agree with the point that if anything, Romney comes across as being not really very up-to-date on foreign affairs. We saw that in his visits, particularly to the UK and then to Israel, and what came out of that, which should have helped build him up, and it undermined him. That does mean that actually the power will not necessarily go to the bureaucracy. I think it'll go to those people that he's appointing, and who are mostly the neoconservatives, primarily many of whom were in the Bush administration. So I think it'll be left to them, as it was left to them and the campaign, to define the foreign policy positions that he took early on. This is a little bit kinder, gentler neoconservative that he projected in terms of tone and style, and perhaps in terms of the ending on the Israel-Palestine question. But by and large, it's not a big shift from the position that he took, except in style and tone.
But very quickly, David Swanson, doesn't this simply mean that the American foreign policy establishment here, I mean, there's a remarkable homogeneity, actually, about it, whether it's Democrat or Republican?
At the Republican National Convention, both Clint Eastwood and Senator Rand Paul proposed immediate withdrawal from Afghanistan and won huge applause. It has the support of 3/4 of Americans. So in taking the very same position on Afghanistan that President Obama takes, Romney is setting himself apart from 3/4 of the country. And this is the problem with a system that has only two available choices. The difference, of course, is that if Romney becomes president, the U.S. peace movement will revive itself out of its hypocritical sleep dramatically. So the net effect could be better than we think.
David Swanson, thank you. Professor Shibley Telhami, thank you. Bruce Fein, thank you very much as well. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.